Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Threat Modeling, Locking the Door on Vulnerabilities. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's session. Ultimately, we want to hear from you. In addition to a few audience polls, we encourage you to submit your questions via the Ask a Question button throughout today's presentation. Our presenter will answer as many questions that we have time for at the very end. If you experience any audio issues during the session, please click on the Rate This button on the top of your player window and follow the instructions to receive help. And just a friendly reminder that this event will be available on demand just a few minutes after the session ends. We invite you to view our channel for all upcoming events and on-demand content after today's session concludes. Now let's get started by introducing our presenter today. Ed Adams is a software quality and security expert with over 20 years experience in the field. He began his career as an engineer for the U.S. Army, which is why he still considers himself an engineer at heart. Later, he served as a member of the Security Innovation Board of Directors since its inception in 2002 and took over as CEO in 2003. Today, Ed is a research fellow at the Ponemon Institute, serves on the board of several IT security organizations, and was named a Privacy by Design Ambassador by the Information and Privacy Commission of Canada. And with that, Ed, it's off to you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and welcome everyone to our threat modeling webcast here. We've got about an hour set aside, and I'm going to do my best to finish up plenty early and give everyone a little bit of time for live Q&A. As Rebecca said, we are recording this presentation and it will be made available for replay. If you just love it so much you want to watch it again, or you want to send the replay link to your colleagues, you can do so. Or perhaps maybe you have to leave early and you want to come back later and watch the rest of it. For those of you who are curious about what I look like, there's a picture of me. And also just a quick snapshot of my history and relevant facts, most of which were already covered by Rebecca, so thank you for that, Rebecca. But as she did mention, I've spent a lot of time researching and building various things in the engineering world. And all throughout my career, I've practiced threat modeling either intuitively or formally, and now I get the chance to talk with you about it as well. Before I get into that, a very brief mention about security innovation. We've been in the software security business for quite a long time, about 15 years. And in those 15 years, we've written 18 different books, including 11 that we co-authored with Microsoft. We've won a number of industry awards, particularly for our training platform, including quite a few just this year. And we've been on the Gartner Magic Quadrant for security training for 4 years in a row ever since its inception. And our core mission is to help organizations secure software, whatever that means to them. And for most of our customers, it means training their engineers on how to write secure code and find security vulnerabilities, and conducting security assessments on software applications, on product and software development teams, as well as on processes to optimize that. Here's our agenda. 3 simple bullets. Shouldn't take us long at all, right? I'm going to start by talking about what threat modeling is, and then we're going to get into some examples of a world with and without threat modeling. And finally, going to finish up with what you should know as a security stakeholder and a member of a software development team. I'll go through probably 5 or 6 different roles to show you how threat modeling can help you. What I'm not going to do is walk through a detailed threat modeling tutorial. I'm not here to teach you how to threat model, more to discuss what threat modeling is and what value it can provide you as a security or business professional at minimizing software risk, which ultimately is the objective of what we do at Security Innovation and the value that you are going to realize. So first polling question is going to revolve around threat modeling. Does your company conduct threat modeling, and if so, in what areas? So let me roll back to that polling question. So first one is, do you conduct threat modeling? Feel free to click on the answer, whether it's regularly, occasionally, rarely, never, and I'll give folks a few minutes to click on the answer that relates to them. Now, it's interesting whenever I see polling questions around does your company threat model, because some companies have a formal process for threat modeling. Some organizations use tools for threat modeling. For example, Microsoft offers a free threat modeling tool for software development teams. Some organizations threat model using tabletop exercises. Some use whiteboards. And other organizations actually play a game. And Microsoft, again, just they happen to be top of mind today, they actually created a card game a few years ago. It's called Elevation of Privilege. And you can download that for free on the Microsoft SDL website. That's SDL as in Secure Development Lifecycle. You can download printable images of the cards and as well as instructions on how to play the game. So there's a lot of different ways that organizations can threat model. And right now, what we're seeing from the audience is, as it's coming in, about 1/3 of the audience regularly threat models, which I'm very happy to hear. 19% occasionally, 30% rarely, and 16% never. So it's actually fairly evenly split. If you look at the bottom two, which is rarely and never, it's about 50%. And if you look at the top two, regularly and occasionally, it's also about 50%. So moving on, let's talk a little bit about threat modeling versus other security techniques, things like design reviews and code reviews and penetration testing. Threat modeling, and I actually do, I subsume attack surface analysis as part of threat modeling because they're both powerful risk mitigation techniques. But they are distinctly different from design review and code review and penetration test. The top three are designed to identify, for the most part, security vulnerabilities or weaknesses in either architectural component diagrams or code itself, or in the as-built or as-deployed system or software application. Whereas threat modeling is intended to identify threats, which are not vulnerabilities, and enable you to devise defenses for those threats. And I find threat modeling very useful at almost any phase, although we see it most commonly used in the design phase. But as stated by Michael Howard, who's the author of Writing Secure Code, his experience showed that nearly half of all security flaws can be discovered in threat modeling, and specifically because it finds different types of threats than those found in code review. Here's a very simple threat model example for you. This is a threat model from Batman, devised by a guy named Sean Gallagher. So I appreciate Mr. Gallagher's imagination here. But threat modeling, on the left-hand side of the diagram, you list out your assets. What are the assets for Batman? Well, Alfred is one, and his information, like emails and texts, is another. And the Batcave, of course, his secret lair. And then on the right-hand side, you identify threats to those assets. The Joker, the police, journalists, etc. And then what you do is you devise protections to protect against each specific threat. And this is a grossly simplified threat model, but it really just meant to illustrate the main purpose and how one begins to devise a threat model. And it sounds simple, it might even sound familiar, because if I asked you to threat model my house or your house, you could probably do so. In fact, you do so almost every single day. The assets in your home are protected from threats, and threats might be a hurricane, threats might be an intruder, threats might be deer in your backyard, if one of your assets are precious blueberry bushes or something like that. And then you devise protections to protect against the threats. And that is the basic premise of threat modeling. Now we're going to get into it in a lot more detail a little bit later on and talk specifically about software threat modeling. We have already had a question from the audience, by the way. Will these slides be available for download? And yes, the slides will be made available to you. And in fact, the entire recording will be made available for playback as well. So not only can you look at my slides, but you can hear my charming voice over and over and over again to your heart's content. So moving on, talking about application threat modeling. And I want to call out the distinction that threats are not vulnerabilities. Threats are perpetual, and vulnerabilities are ways that threats can be realized. So the vulnerabilities can be fixed most of the time, but threats are perpetual. And like any threat modeling exercise, if you're doing this for a software application or a collection of software applications, you start with the threats. So what's listed on the slides, vulnerabilities are unmitigated threats, and another way to say that is just it's a mechanism through which a threat can be realized. And the whole purpose of threat modeling is building that mitigation or that brick wall to stop and prevent all of the threats from becoming exploited vulnerabilities. So that's what a threat model is. Next logical question might be why? Why to create a threat model? And threat modeling, pretty straightforward if you're just trying to minimize threats and risks, but there's a lot more value behind that. Threat modeling can help align a team's understanding of risk, of problems that could occur. And what that enables you to do is minimize the knee-jerk reactions to events or other compliance initiatives like an upcoming audit or something like that. It also allows you to act more swiftly when things like heartbleed occur, because you'll know exactly where you may or may not be vulnerable if you've done your threat model correctly, and then you can act swiftly because of it. So it builds that shared understanding, prevents knee-jerk reactions from events, but also enables you to act in more intelligent, informed ways. And that, again, is the core value here. It's also a very reliable way to measure security choices against each other and prioritize your security spend, because I still have yet to meet an organization that has unlimited budget, so you have to prioritize everything that you're doing, and identifying both business level and system level security flaws will allow you to do that, and threat modeling allows you to do that. Again, unlike something like a code review where you're just looking at code level potential security problems, threat modeling also allows you to envision business logic threats and attacks that could happen and put defenses in place as a result of it. Now, what threat models are not is also an important level set here. They're not a test plan, and they're not a proof of security. They're also not a design review. They are a type of review or a type of analysis, but it's not a design review, it's not a test plan, and it's not necessarily a representation of how an attacker approaches a particular system. But threat modeling can help in all of these areas. So even though a threat model is not a test plan, it can help drive the security aspects of your test plan. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples in a few different slides of how once you've built a threat model, you've got the basis of a test case for each one of those threats, and in some cases, multiple test cases for each one of those threats. So we'll plow right along. There's a lot of reasons that I enjoy threat modeling. First of all, I mean, as a CEO of a company, I do threat modeling on a regular basis on my company itself because I'm responsible for managing corporate risk. I ask my R&D team to conduct threat modeling on specific software applications that they're building that's either running our corporate enterprise or that we're selling to our customers to ensure that we're not putting our customers or our own selves at risks. But I also like to use it personally because, frankly, my marriage depends on minimizing threats and reducing bad decisions. Because I'm a mechanical engineer, I'm a tinkerer. I love tinkering with stuff, especially when something isn't working. So if I have a video doorbell that starts to malfunction, my initial reaction is to go and fix it. However, I try to get some discipline around making wise investments with my limited resources, which is what threat modeling is all about. So why would I spend time trying to fix this video doorbell when the larger alarm system in my house is broken in the first place? So that's the kind of thing from a personal perspective that I like to use threat modeling for. But also from a cognitive approach, I love disciplined engineering approaches. It's what I was trained at in school and what I executed on my professional career as a mechanical engineer for the U.S. Army and then for a systems integrator for the U.S. Army. However, I left that world and I entered the software development world, and I thought everyone had lost their minds, to be honest with you, because there was a little bit less discipline in the software engineering world than what I was used to in the mechanical engineering world. And there was a lot more of what I say on the screen here is gut feel in terms of approaches to problems and threats and defenses. And the introduction of threat modeling into software development discipline really helped mitigate a lot of that gut feel because after all, when you talk with software development teams, a lot of them will tell you that software development is as much art as it is science. And that, to me, was a very foreign concept, for sure. But that's the world that we live in, and that's the world that I came from. So moving on. So let's walk through some examples of worlds with and without threat modeling. Now, this picture that is showing up on your screen, it is something that's called the Headington shark. It is, I believe, art. Although each person's interpretation of art is different than the next. But the reason I like this picture is because it reminds me of a house that is built on, let's imagine a seaside town that this house is at. And right in front of the house or next to the house is a huge restaurant, a very popular restaurant, and the restaurant has this 30-foot model of a shark hanging out front because it's a seafood restaurant. It's trying to attract customers with some kitschy hanging shark. So I would look at that and I say, well, from a threat modeling perspective, if I've got valuable assets, would I put them in my attic? Would I put them on my main home? Would I put them in my garage? Would I put them in a basement? And I go through, that threat modeling process. So what could happen to my valuable assets if I put them in the basement near a seaside town? Well, it could be prone to flooding. What would happen if I put them on the main floor of my house and say it's a one-story house? Well, someone could break in through the window or the door and steal them. And then, well, what if I put them in the attic? Well, someone would have to break in first and then figure out that they're in the attic and then find them in the attic and take them away. So I might actually choose to put my valuables in the attic of this one-story home as opposed to the main floor, as opposed to in a basement. I might choose to put them in a safe regardless of where I store them in my house. And if I look at the likelihood of a 30-foot shark model crashing through the roof of my house and flooding my attic and ruining my assets, I'm going to put that very, very low on the likelihood scale. And even if there was a hurricane coming, I'd probably be more worried about the hurricane ripping off my roof or shattering my windows than picking up this 30-foot shark and throwing it through my roof. Now, of course, weird stuff like this happens all the time. My company, Security Innovation, was at one point in time based in Melbourne, Florida. And Melbourne, Florida is right on the east coast of Florida. And one year, we're enduring one of the many hurricanes that Floridians endure every year. And I happened to come across a fascinating picture of a church where the entire steeple of the church had blown off, and just like a arrow tip or a spear had gone right through the roof of the church, of the adjacent building, smashed right through it. It's an amazing picture. You can find it if you search for it online. Melbourne, Florida church steeple through roof, something like that. We'll do it for you. But again, that's one of those threats I never would have threat modeled for, because not even in my wildest dreams would I imagine something like that happening. And with the limited resources that I had, I would probably look to protect my roof in many different ways. I don't even know how you'd protect against something like that. And that's kind of the point with threat modeling, is that some threats, even if you imagine them and they're very creative like that, you either can't protect against it, or you just choose to accept the risk of that threat being realized. Okay. We've talked a little bit about what this is, the process of threat modeling already. It's all about identifying the assets you're trying to protect, envisioning the threats that put those assets under threat or under attack, and then determine what's the likelihood of each threat being realized. And if you determine that the likelihood is beyond a certain threshold that you're comfortable with, what mitigations can be put into place to minimize the impact of that threat or thwart the threat altogether. And wow, thwart the threat. 3 TH words in a row. Not the easiest to say. I did a little tongue twister on myself. But that is what threat modeling is about. And as you apply it to the software world, and we'll show this in a few examples a little bit later on, it's not as difficult as you think. In fact, it's actually quite intuitive, and and it's something that you can practice on a regular basis. So just like that example a few slides ago about the Headington shark, that's not a threat I would even think about, even though that is art. If it were a massive model of a shark crashing through my roof, or it were a steeple crashing through my roof, I never would have probably would have never modeled a defense against it. Next, I want to talk just a bit about threat modeling versus threat intelligence. Threat intelligence is something that is intended to give you real-time data so you can react to it. And so there's going to be a lot of sensors generating a lot of data, much of it being in real time, and feeding it to you so you can understand what's going on. Threat modeling is not threat intelligence. Threat modeling is a way to measure and reduce your attack surface and focus your limited resources in the most productive ways. And unlike threat intelligence, which can give you that quick, rapid, real-time information, threat modeling is part of a more strategic, thoughtful program of mitigating risk. And this is a common threat model, or a section of a threat model, and this is just a tree view. You can use a flow chart like this. You can use tree views. You can use mind maps. It doesn't really matter what form you take, so long as the function remains the same. And again, identifying assets under threat, devising threats, and then creating actions, and in some cases, sub-actions to mitigate each one of those threats. And in this particular example, the threat of an attacker impersonating a user, could be spoofing an authentication token or uncovering user credentials. And then for each one of those, how do you devise some defenses against it? And we're going to talk specifically about some examples in software and IT in a few minutes. But first, we're going to start with our own tabletop exercise. And here, here's the setup. Let's say I own a house. And let's say that house is on the ocean, similar to the one that we just imagined a few slides ago with that Headington shark. We imagined that was not art, it was something different. But let's say I own a house on an ocean. It has an attached jewelry and art gallery. So what are the components in play here? It's the house, it's the ocean, which could create some threats. It's the art gallery. I go through the process of enumerating my assets, which is the artwork, it's the jewels, it's the personal property, since it's both my home as well as my business, and my cat Felix, also potentially a threat, and he's an asset that I want to protect. So what I want to do next is I want to create a threat model to mitigate the risk of bad things happening, a natural disaster since I'm near the ocean, damage, theft, etc. And the image to the right is an image of a castle, obviously, and all the different attack points or entry points or compromise points of that castle. And that castle is a good visual depiction of an attack surface analysis. And on the left-hand side is really just a text explanation of something relatively simple and relatively similar. But what I've done here on the next slide is I've taken that tabletop exercise with my art gallery and home near the ocean, and I've actually provided an overlay to 5 of the OWASP top 10 threats. And OWASP, for those of you that are not familiar, is the Open Web Application Security project. And the OWASP top 10, probably the most popular and well-known project from OWASP, is a list of the 10 most significant threats to a software application or a web application in particular. And then, of course, OWASP has a lot of interesting and useful things that you can do to protect against that. Now, in this example here, what I've done is I've taken 5 of those OWASP threats, and I've explained what that might look like in the real world or the physical world, and exactly what it might look like in the software world. So, for example, sensitive data exposure. In the physical world, which is in my art gallery in my home, items could be stolen en route to the gallery because the route is not secure that I chose. And in the software world, it's just like credentials getting sniffed over a network or passing authentication metrics in the clear, which also relates to the next one. And as you go down, example by example, and I won't bore you by going through each one of these, especially because the slides will be available. You see the analogies, and broken access control on the bottom. Another good example here, or insufficient monitoring and logging. Just to tie back into that video doorbell example that I used earlier, where items might be able to get stolen without tracing an attacker because my video doorbell either isn't installed or isn't working. That being similar to deleting database tables and not logging database activity. So simple threat modeling exercises in the physical world can be mapped into the software world, and I'm trying to do this to get you just a little bit more comfortable with it, because as I mentioned earlier, everyone actually does threat model on a regular basis in their personal lives, and they just might not realize it. You leave your home every day, and do you lock your door or not? I lock my door, and I lock my door because I'm trying to prevent someone from breaking into my house. And I have an alarm system, but I only have an alarm system on my first floor doors and windows and not my second floor, because I've determined that the risk of someone breaking into my second floor windows is significantly high enough that I'm willing to accept that risk and not put an alarm system on it due to the cost and complexity. But my first floor doors and windows, that has enough risk that I'm willing to bear that cost and that expense. And what I'm doing there is I'm coding defensively by protecting my house. So my house is built, and I'm putting some additional defenses on it to protect against those threats. And that's exactly what threat modeling can do for security developers, for security testers, because as you're defining these threats, you're also defining potential abuse cases, and those abuse cases can be translated into test cases from unit testing in code to penetration testing to integration and system testing, etc. And as you're defining all these threats, keep on referring back to the threat model to figure out if there's a countermeasure that can be used. For example, can I encrypt data and traffic and at rest and in transit, and what is that going to get me? Or if I've determined that I'm building a web application and I'm asking the user for input in a specific field, if I'm going to spit that back to them on a confirmation page, thank you, Julia, for your purchase of Picasso's art painting number 757. That is representing a potential reflective cross-site scripting vulnerability in my web application. Well, how can I protect it against cross-site scripting? Well, if I'm writing in .NET, I could use an anti-cross-site scripting library, which comes as part of that framework automatically. So again, just kind of ticking through all of the potential threats in your software application, identifying how you can protect those assets. And a lot of instances, there are built-in mitigating controls or defenses in frameworks like .NET in this example that you can take advantage of, and you may not even realize that they're there unless you go through and do this threat model. Now, let's consider a world without threat modeling, for example. And this particular picture, which I've used for a number of years, is a great example of deployment of resources in the wrong place. They put a gate down at the driveway of this building or this office park, yet there's no fence around it and no other defense mechanism, so folks don't bother stopping at the gate. They just drive around the gate. And again, this is a real picture, just like the Headington shark. It's not something made up or photoshopped, but you can imagine where this might be. Whether you're creating a fantasy like we did with our house by the sea, or whether this is a reality and you look out your office window and you see something like this. But this is basically just inappropriate use of resources. It takes time and money to install that gate, and then you've got some controls on the gate and some kind of monitoring on the gate, yet the gate is giving you zero value for that investment. And that's the world without threat modeling. So let's take the example here of whether or not you might be vulnerable to that Heartbleed problem that we all had to deal with for a number of years back. It wasn't all that long ago. So in this particular threat tree, for threat number 12, we said there's a compromise of an application password, and that could be realized through accessing it in use, or getting it out of the database, or just guessing the password. And then you continue down and you build out your sub-actions. So you could have gotten access to your password from a phishing attack, or you could have accessed the database because you're passing it in clear text, et cetera, et cetera. And then you go through and you determine, well, for all of these potential threats, how am I going to protect myself? And the green boxes are the countermeasures against the white boxes that they're attached to, which are the threats. So for example, the threat of, as you go down from 1.3, accessing the password in the database, to compromising the database, which is 1.3.2. How can you compromise the database? Well, you might be able to do that with a SQL injection attack, which is 1.3.2.1. And to prevent against a SQL injection attack, in this instance, we decided we're going to use parameterized queries. However, you could have decided to put a web application firewall in place, or you could have decided to sanitize user input by any number of different measures. It doesn't matter how you actually do it in this particular case. The process of threat modeling, of identifying a password can be compromised in the database. This is one way it could be compromised in the database, and here's how we're going to protect it. So similarly, if you are trying to protect your network from getting sniffed, which is a threat that we talked about just a few slides ago, you might want to use TLS to encrypt that network traffic. Well, great. In this case, we chose to use OpenSSL 1.0. And the nice thing about threat models is that they are living assets. They're persistent. So when Heartbleed came out, we could have looked at our threat model and determined, are we vulnerable to Heartbleed? Well, very quickly we could devise that we're using OpenSSL 1.0.1f, and that particular version of the OpenSSL libraries is vulnerable to Heartbleed. Well, okay, holy crap, we've got to change that out. If we were using a different version of OpenSSL that was not vulnerable to Heartbleed, we wouldn't have to do anything. And that, again, is the value of threat modeling, to enable you to make informed and quick decisions and avoid knee-jerk reactions like ripping out all TLS everywhere and changing all OpenSSL to some other form of SSL because you don't know if you're vulnerable. So you're just going to take a non-vulnerable library and throw it everywhere, as opposed to doing it selectively and only in those areas where you are vulnerable. So here, just an example of an actual threat model from an application that, in this case, was vulnerable to Heartbleed. But keep in mind that threats do vary and evolve. And when you have a threat model that is a persistent asset, like most of them are, you can keep up with those threats in more rapid fashion, just like Heartbleed. You know, most folks didn't know what Heartbleed was 4 or 5 years ago. Now, almost everyone in the cybersecurity industry knows what Heartbleed is. And keep in mind that different software applications can be attacked in different ways if they're deployed on different platforms. There are, web attacks that are not relevant to mobile attacks, and vice versa. When mobile started eating the world a number of years ago, all of a sudden an attack returned, or a vulnerability returned, that had almost disappeared for most web applications, and specifically it was the buffer overflow. And now that mobile applications were being written in Objective-C, they were susceptible to buffer overflows, which the main web platforms like Java and .NET were catching automatically. And as I mentioned, threats change over time. So the mitigations that you put in place today might not work next week, next month, or next year. And that's the value of doing regular testing and routine testing. So again, threat models, they don't give you perfect information about threats, but they help you make smarter decisions. And that's what risk management from a software perspective is going to deliver in terms of value. Is avoid those big decisions and make smart investments with limited resources that you have. Another example here in banking application. Typical elements in an attack surface. This banking application uses TLS. From an authentication perspective, you've got your username and password, but you also use security questions. It might be SMS verification codes for two-factor authentication. You've got cookie-based tokens that you use for session management, et cetera, et cetera. And from that, you can imagine a bunch of attacks that might happen. Now, you could steal credentials from the session ID. How could you transfer funds? What about reading, updating, and deleting logs or messages to hide nefarious activity? So again, just an example in a real world application, in this case, a banking application, just to help give you some additional data and additional examples as you take this back and apply it to your world, whether that's in a trucking and logistics company or in a gaming company. Doesn't really matter. Threat modeling can apply. So now let's talk a little bit about threat modeling in software development, specifically at different phases. And I know there's the buzzword of the day from a software development perspective is DevOps or SecDevOps. And it was Agile before that, and before that it was I forget what it was, extreme programming. But all of them have a lot of similarities, which is the attempt to unify teams both pre and post to development from a tools perspective, a process perspective, a language normalization perspective, etc. However, almost every product that gets developed still follows 5 simple phases define the requirements, design the solution, construct the solution, test the solution, and then deploy, ship, and maintain the solution. So, I try to simplify software development into those 5 areas. And for each of those areas, just want to briefly touch upon how you can potentially leverage threat modeling. So at the requirements phase, here you're defining objectives or asking questions from a requirements perspective. So the second bullet here, business processes, are security checked as a requirement and documented. So do you need single sign-on? And if so, why do you need single sign-on? And what is the benefit or risk of security of single sign-on? Do you want to use multi-factor authentication? Do you want to set that as a requirement? And if you do want to set it as a requirement, what threat are you trying to defend against by mandating or requiring multi-factor authentication for this particular application? As you continue down my simplified 5-step software development process recipe, you hit the design phase where software architects take the requirements and make design choices and component choices. So let's say we do want multi-factor authentication. That's a requirement. So now the architect has to decide what kind of multi-factor authentication do we want. Do we want to use a mobile application like a Duo Security or Google Authenticator? Do we want to use SMS texting? Do we want to use biometrics? And then each one of those, of course, have their own trade-offs from a cost and implementation and security perspective. Also, the architect is going to make decisions on which external libraries to use, which development frameworks to use. They might decide on Java versus .NET for a variety of different reasons. But again, these threat modeling can help you make those determinations more effectively and easier as you are considering the security aspects of your design. And an important thing to note, which is the very first bullet on the slide, is that over half of software defects are introduced during either requirements or design. And that's a data point that's been around for a number of years. And in fact, I think Steve McConnell was the first one to document that in Code Complete. And I've seen a number of studies over the years where that number is held up. And a lot of folks think about securing software applications as securing the code or training the developers that are writing the code. But in many cases, developers are implementing the requirements correctly, and it's the requirements or the design that is either omitting or enabling the insecurity of the implementation. So moving on, and I'm jumping right past code and getting into testing at this point in time. I actually think that threat modeling has the biggest value when it comes to testing, whether it's testing at the code level or testing in the quality assurance or as-built or verification phase. Because what you're trying to do with testing is just validating that you've implemented things correctly. And a number of years ago, well, actually, even still today, for those organizations that don't practice security as part of the software development lifecycle, the majority of the time spent by a quality assurance or test professional is to validate the application spec. And the application spec you can think about as the set of requirements that came down from the business analyst or the product manager. So you're validating, all of the requirements. There are functional requirements, performance requirements. Well, if there are security requirements as well, then that, by definition, provides a validation point for a test or a quality engineer to go ahead and try to prove as right or wrong. And threat models really drive test cases just so darn effectively because you've identified the asset you're protecting, you've identified a specific threat or a series of threats, and what the purpose of the validation or the testing phase is to determine whether or not the mitigation that you have in place is effective or not. So you're going all the way down the threat tree for each one of these threats, and you're outlining or stubbing a test case or a security test case for the tester or for the test activity. So I think it's really terrific. And for those who outsource their code or outsource software development, you can use a threat model to drive your acceptance testing. Let's say you use a Tap Tower, a Wipro, or an Accenture to write a lot of software code for you. And your service level agreement says that you won't pay for it or you won't accept it until it's gone through your acceptance testing criteria. Well, if you don't have security test cases as part of your acceptance test criteria, then you'll have no idea whether or not you're inheriting vulnerabilities from your bespoke developers or your outsourced partner. And again, threat modeling helps there in a very significant way to minimize the risk of outsourced software development. And this, here you go, just a good example or illustration of that. The second sub-bullet of the second bullet, which is supercharging your service level agreements or SLAs with acceptance testing criteria, for example, passing the OWASP Top 10. Now, what including that simple phrase, for example, in a service level agreement is not only going to put some pressure on your software development partner, your outsourced partner, to validate that OWASP Top 10 threats are mitigated against, but it also is giving your internal acceptance testing team a decent framework from which to drive their acceptance testing activities. And what it does is it forces that conversation to be had that is a risk-based planning conversation. And I must have said the word risk 50 times in this presentation over the last 45 minutes because threat modeling ultimately is a risk management technique. And when applied to software development and software management, you are now delivering risk-driven, value-added information and data to your software development process. And that's a very valuable thing in my opinion. This slide here, again, illustrating essentially what I was just saying. And this is the final phase, that deployment phase. We've gone through requirements, we've gone through design, we've gone through coding, we've gone through testing, and now we're in deployment. Well, lo and behold, if you want to conduct a deployment review, just like you might conduct a design review or a code review, guess what you can use to ensure that all of your configurations are done right? Well, sure enough, the threat model. You may have built your software application in-house, but now you want to go deploy it in AWS or Microsoft Azure. And as you deploy it and you hand it over to your operations team, they may not have configured that cloud infrastructure appropriately. They might not have remembered to turn on your web application firewall. So are you still susceptible to that SQL injection attack that we showed in that threat tree 10, 15 slides ago? Well, you might be if your configuration is not done properly. So threat modeling here helping you in the operations or the ops phase as well as the development or the dev phase. But again, it's all about making informed decisions and allocating your precious resources as smartly and effectively as possible. So what good is any webcast without a checklist? So here's your checklist. And we've eliminated it to six bullets in this case. And what this is elements of an effective threat modeling program. I say that it's agile. The most important piece to me is that it's actionable. Threat modeling is intended to allow you to build action plans and then measure the effectiveness of those action plans. You can't have anything worth a hill of beans unless you can measure it, and you can't measure things effectively unless you know what the desired outcome is, and that's what an actionable threat model and threat modeling plan is all about. And it also has to be tangible, so be specific. We talked about, on 2 slides ago, having OWASP Top 10 threats as a specific call to action for an outsourced developer or acceptance testing criteria. Well, that's a fairly specific control. And you can get a lot more specific than that, by the way, but that's a good starting point. And that's going to help you build your abuse cases and define your security requirements. And I've actually seen threat modeling done as effectively starting from early in the software development lifecycle as opposed to starting late in the software development lifecycle. Mostly I see it beginning with the definition of assets and then creating threats against those assets and then building mitigations against those threats to protect the assets. But you can also start at the other end and kind of flip it on its head. Let's imagine the most likely threats to this application in deployment and then determine how effective they can be at getting to assets under protection. So it can work in both directions. Ideally, threat modeling is integrating with your threat intelligence program, whether it is the identification of real-time or real-world attacks, the analysis of a newly realized threat, and the one that we used as an example in this webcast was Heartbleed. That's another talisman of an effective threat modeling program. And the last bullet, which is the last one that I'll read, is constraining the software development team to use consistent and ideally portable components like an authentication library. Because you don't necessarily want your software engineers and developers writing their own authentication libraries if you can create one that can be universal for all of your .NET web applications, for example. Why not just create one, test the heck out of that, and then as a requirement, have all of your software development teams that are writing .NET applications use that specific authentication library instead of having them create one on their own. It's the same reason why it's not a great idea to create your own crypto algorithms. Those are difficult things to get right, and there's a lot of time-tested, effective ones that you can just use as an alternative. So here's my summary slide with 8 minutes to go in the hour, now 7, and 3 bullets with 1 bottom line, which is where I'll finish, which is threat modeling is an effective means to align teams and get that language normalization that is such an important part of any effective software development lifecycle, whether it's a DevOps methodology or an agile methodology or pick your flavor of the month buzzword methodology. Language normalization is going to be key in getting stakeholders all on the same page, so to speak, to discuss risks and threats as opposed to triaging specific bugs, because that's where you as a cybersecurity professional or a software development team member can add value to your business, your organization, if you're able to elevate your language to the language of risk and threats, because that's what all of the business professionals and most of the executives are worrying about. Executives and board members don't want to see a 60-page report on all of the potential holes in a specific IT system. They just want to know where they're most at risk of a significantly negative event happening and what the heck you're going to do to prevent the likelihood of that negative event. And that is where threat modeling comes in. That, in my opinion, is the biggest value that you can extract out of threat modeling. It's an effective, low impact, low technology solution. There's not a lot of techniques that you'll hear about these days that don't require you to go either learn some new tool or new technology, but threat modeling is one of them. As I mentioned, you can play it as a card game, on a whiteboard, as a tabletop exercise, or just as a conversation that you jot down on a chalkboard, a notebook. It doesn't really matter. It's low tech, high value, but it's also, unfortunately, highly underutilized, and that's really why I wanted to spend this hour talking with you all today. And with that, let me pause, toss the microphone back to Rebecca as I review some of the questions that have come in.
Great, thanks, Ed. So as Ed's going through some of the questions that's come in, it looks like we have about 6. So I'll let him review those and answer those, but I did just want to pop on and let everyone know, as Ed mentioned, you will be receiving a copy of the recording and as well as the presentation. We'll also be sending around a trial for some of our threat modeling courses. So be on the lookout for that email either later today or tomorrow morning.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. So there's a few questions that I will answer in the next couple of minutes before we stop the recording, and I will endeavor to stay on as long as I can afterwards to answer questions via text, since the voice is most likely going to cut out. So one question was, what is my opinion of OWASP ASVS? And for those that don't know, ASVS is the Application Security Verification Standard, which it's one of the OWASP projects that's intended to normalize language and coverage when it comes to web application verification. It's meant to be an open standard, as is everything with OWASP. And what I say about that in particular is that it is, like a lot of different things, a good place to start. So my opinion of it is that it's worth looking into for sure. Any type of standard that provides a level of normalization, whether it's about risks, it's about vulnerabilities, it's about language, is worth taking a look at. And I've known a number of organizations that have looked at it and or are using it actively. So I definitely encourage folks to do it. So another question that came in is what threats do you see with respect to GDPR requirements, which is a new general data protection rule soon to become law in the EU, although it affects pretty much everybody. So the threats to GDPR. This is, we could have probably a number of different webcasts on this one, but there are a lot of threats to GDPR. The most significant threats are things like the fines, which can be up to 4% of the annual revenue or turnover of an organization, which is massive. I mean, that is a very, very steep penalty and fine that's enforceable by law. So you look at that and you think, well, that's a real significant risk. And what I always drive to with GDPR is, what is the realization of that threat happening, as opposed to just being exposed or vulnerable to it. I think, just my personal opinion, that GDPR, the main purpose of GDPR was, to strong arm the hands of companies like Google and Facebook, who, in the opinion of the European lawmakers and most European citizens, have taken too many liberties with the privacy information that they collect from their users. So, I think it was really targeted at that. But the threats are real, and they're significant. So, the question really is, and threat modeling can be used to pretty rapidly, identify what the threats are. The assets are pretty well defined. The assets is all about any personally identifiable information you're collecting. That's the data. That's the data you're trying to protect. And what threat modeling will help you identify is what data is in scope and what data is not in scope. And once you identify that data that's in scope, then you can determine what protections to put in place. And there are some, frankly, that are required, such as the opt-in option. So you're not allowed to market to someone unless they've explicitly given you the right under GDPR. So you have to determine for yourself what you need to do in order to adhere to that requirement, for example. So, but as I mentioned, there's a lot that we could talk about with respect to GDPR. I will stop it there. So another question that came in. So what kind of tools are best suited to give us an idea of whether our products are threat modeled or have been threat modeled? And it's a great question, and I don't have a good answer for you, to be honest with you. In order to determine whether or not your products have been threat modeled, the best way to determine it is to conduct a threat model. And it's pretty for you, let's say you're using a commercial off-the-shelf, product like, an SAP HANA, component for supply chain management. You install it and configure it in your system, threat model it using your data, because really that's just the application that's managing and processing your data. And as these threats that you're imagining as you're going through and determining how that could be realized and they could compromise your data, you may come across problems with the SAP software itself, and that of course will tell you that they have not properly gone through a threat modeling exercise, and it may enable you to either go back to SAP and request additional due diligence, especially if you haven't made the purchase yet. You can set that as a requirement in your surface level agreement, or you can go back to them and excuse me, and ask for some kind of compensation or recommendations on how to mitigate a threat if they are not willing or able to fix the code, because you may be able to use a web application firewall in front of your SAP application to mitigate that particular risk that you've seen. So anyways, just another example, I am being notified by the BrightTalk platform that this will automatically end in less than 1 minute. So it feels like that bomb countdown in a Tom Cruise action movie. So if I can't defuse this bomb in the next 30 seconds, your webcast will end. So with that, I will stop answering questions live, we'll stop the recording, and I will stay on the line to try to answer some additional questions in text. So I thank you all for your time. I very much appreciate you all sticking with me throughout this hour. I hope you've learned something. I've certainly enjoyed talking about threat modeling, but then again, I always do. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your day wherever you are.